The Echo of Hooves. It was a bleak evening in December, the sort when the London fog clings to the windows like damp wool and the gas lamps in Baker Street burn with a sullen, muffled glow. The fire in our sitting room at 221B had sunk low, and Sherlock Holmes, restless from a fortnight without a case, sprawled in his armchair staring at the ceiling while his pipe lay cold upon the table. I was half dozing over the evening paper when my friend suddenly sat upright, his head tilted as though catching a sound beyond my hearing. "Listen, Watson," he said in a low voice. Above the faint patter of rain upon the panes came the measured clip-clop of hooves upon wet cobblestones, echoing up from the street below with that peculiar hollowness the fog imparts to every noise. The rhythm was steady and unhurried, yet it carried an odd insistence, as though the sound were being thrown back from the surrounding walls. Holmes was at the window in an instant, parting the curtain just enough to peer into the murk. I joined him, and together we watched as a small covered delivery cart emerged from the swirling yellow haze and drew up directly beneath our lamps. The horse, a sturdy bay, stood steaming in the drizzle, while the driver, a thick-set man in a frieze coat and battered bowler, descended stiffly from his seat and moved to the rear to unload. He lifted down one wooden crate and set it upon the pavement with a thud. As he reached for the second, he suddenly paused, swayed, and pressed a gloved hand to his chest. Even from 2 stories above, the rigidity of his posture spoke of sudden, acute distress. Holmes's fingers tightened upon the curtain. "The man is in mortal agony," he murmured. The driver staggered against the wheel, his breath coming in visible gasps. With a desperate effort, he fumbled at his belt, drew forth a clasp knife, flicked it open, and in 2 frantic slashes severed the reins close to the bit. Freed of restraint, the horse threw up its head, snorted in alarm, and bolted forward. The empty cart lurched but remained stationary as the animal thundered away down Baker Street, loose reins trailing, the echo of its hooves fading rapidly until the fog swallowed it completely. The driver, meanwhile, slid slowly down the spokes of the wheel and collapsed upon the wet cobblestones, one arm flung out, his face upturned to the drifting rain. He did not move again. Holmes was already reaching for his ulster. "Come, Watson, coats and hats. The man is dead or as good as, and there is villainy here." In moments we were clattering down the 17 steps and out into the chilling damp. The abandoned cart stood forlorn beneath the gas lamp, rain drumming softly upon its canvas tilt, while the body of the driver lay huddled beside the wheel, his eyes staring sightlessly into the mist. Holmes knelt swiftly, his fingers seeking pulse at throat and wrist. "Gone," he pronounced quietly. "Dead these 3 or 4 minutes. No mark of violence, yet death was sudden and unnatural." He rose and turned his keen gaze upon the cart, the hunter's light already kindling in his eyes. The lethargy of the evening had vanished as though it had never existed. "Note how he severed the reins in his final moments," Holmes said. "A deliberate act, not the spasm of a dying man. He wished the horse to flee, perhaps as a signal, perhaps to create confusion. Whatever the reason, this is no commonplace demise." "Note the crates, Watson," he said, his voice sharp with interest. "The labels are fresh, the rope newly cut. And yet the horse was released in a manner that suggests the driver knew his moments were numbered. Why sever the reins unless he wished the animal to flee? A signal, perhaps, or a warning?" He lifted the lid of the nearest crate with care, peered within, then gave a low exclamation of surprise. "Well, well," he murmured. "This simple delivery cart carries a cargo far more valuable and far more dangerous than appears at first sight." I stepped closer, and in the dim glow of the street lamp saw what had caught his attention. Nestled among packing straw lay row upon row of handsome silver pocket watches, their cases gleaming like frost in the rain. "Valuable cargo for a common delivery cart," I remarked. "The man must have been carrying them to some jeweller in the West End." Holmes shook his head. Observe the labels upon the crates, freshly printed, yet the ink has run slightly in the rain. The addresses are vague. Mr. J. Hargrove, jeweller, London. No street given. And note the rope. New hemp, cut with a sharp blade, not frayed as it would be after long use. He reached into the crate and lifted out one of the watches, turning it over in the lamplight. Even my unpracticed eye could see that it was a fine piece. Heavy silver case, engine turned back, Roman numerals upon an enamel dial. Yet Holmes's expression grew steadily more grim. He produced his lens and examined the watch with minute care, first the case, then the movement visible through the open back. "Curious," he murmured. "Exceedingly curious. The hallmark is English, London assay, 1891, yet the escapement is unmistakably Swiss. The balance wheel is of a pattern favoured in the Jura factories, and the jewelling is irregular. These are counterfeits, Watson. Clever ones, but counterfeits nonetheless." He replaced the watch and turned to the constable, who stood gaping beside us. "This cart and its contents are to be left exactly as they are until Inspector Lestrade arrives. No one is to touch the crates. The body, of course, must go to the mortuary, but the flask in the coat pocket is to be preserved untouched." The officer touched his helmet and began to clear the small knot of onlookers. Holmes drew me a little aside, his eyes gleaming with that fierce excitement I knew so well. The driver was poisoned, deliberately and with foreknowledge of his route. He severed the reins in his dying moments, freeing the horse to bolt as a signal, perhaps, or to create confusion. But why? And who stood to gain by his death and the exposure of this cargo? He glanced up at our lighted windows above. "We shall take a selection of these watches upstairs for closer study. The game is afoot, Watson, and it promises to be a pretty problem." Thus, upon a rainy December night, drawn by the echo of hooves through the London fog, my friend Sherlock Holmes found himself embarked upon a case as subtle and far-reaching as any in our long association. We carried a selection of the watches upstairs to our sitting room, along with the dead man's flask and a few other small articles that Holmes had abstracted from the cart with the constable's reluctant permission. The fire had been built up in our absence by Mrs. Hudson, and the familiar room with its chemical-stained table and scattered papers seemed a haven after the chill dampness of the street. Holmes lost no time. Throwing off his ulster, he cleared a space upon the table, laid out the watches in orderly rows beneath the gas lamp, and began his examination with that intense concentration which I had so often observed. I drew up a chair opposite him and watched in silence, knowing that any interruption at such a moment would be unwelcome. He took up the first watch, a handsome silver hunter with engine-turned case, and turned it over in his long, nervous fingers. Then, producing his powerful lens, he studied first the outer case, then the movement through the open back. "Observe, Watson," he said at length, without looking up. "The hallmark purports to be that of the London Assay Office for 1892, lion passant, leopard's head, and the date letter R in Gothic shield. Yet the punch is shallow, the edges slightly blurred. A good imitation, but an imitation nonetheless." He passed the watch to me. Even to my untrained eye, the mark did indeed appear less crisp than those I had seen upon genuine pieces. "The movement is more revealing," he continued, opening another. "The escapement is a Swiss lever of the type manufactured in large quantities in the canton of Neuchâtel. The balance wheel is compensated, but the jewelling is irregular. Only 15 stones where an English maker of this quality would use 17 or 18, and several of the jewels are merely glass painted red to simulate rubies." He laid the watch down and took up a third. "Note also the engraving upon the back, J. Hargrove and Son, London. There is no such firm in the post office directory, nor in the list of established watchmakers. The script is careful, but the serifs are slightly too heavy, characteristic of the German engravers employed in certain Swiss factories to imitate English work." I picked up one of the open-faced watches and wound it gently. It ticked with a steady, reassuring note. "Yet they appear excellent timekeepers," I remarked. "Precisely," said Holmes with a grim smile. "That is the danger. These are no crude forgeries to deceive only the ignorant. They are designed to pass muster with experienced jewelers. Good movements, well-finished cases, plausible hallmarks. Introduced into the market in sufficient quantity, they could seriously undercut the legitimate trade." He turned his attention to the flask taken from the driver's pocket, a small silver-plated spirit flask with a screw cap. He unscrewed it cautiously and sniffed the contents. Brandy, good French brandy, but with a faint overlay of something sharper. Bitter almonds, as I thought, hydrocyanic acid, diluted and mixed with the spirit. A dose sufficient to kill within minutes, yet slow enough for the man to realize his danger and attempt that desperate signal with the reins. He set the flask aside and leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together, his eyes half closed. "The picture begins to form, Watson. A smuggling operation bringing counterfeit Swiss watches into London, evading duty and flooding the market at prices no honest English maker can meet. The cart was one of their regular deliveries, perhaps to a receiver in the West End who would distribute them to less scrupulous retailers. Someone wished to disrupt this trade. The driver was poisoned, either by a rival faction or by a legitimate importer driven to desperation. The severing of the reins was intended as a warning or signal to accomplices. The game is up, scatter. But death came too swiftly for it to serve its purpose." He opened his eyes and reached for his pipe. "We have here a pretty little problem involving commerce, crime, and chemistry. Tomorrow we shall trace the provenance of these watches more thoroughly, and perhaps identify the unfortunate driver. For tonight, let us secure our evidence and allow Scotland Yard its routine inquiries." Yet even as he spoke, I could see that his mind was already ranging far ahead, following invisible threads through the labyrinth of London's underworld. The echo of hooves that had drawn him to the window had awakened the hunter, and I knew that he would not rest until the quarry was run to earth. The morning found Sherlock Holmes already at work. I awoke to the aroma of strong coffee and the faint tang of chemical reagents, and descending to our sitting room discovered my friend surrounded by a chaos of papers, maps, and the counterfeit watches laid out like specimens upon the table. He had evidently been up for hours. His violin lay untouched in its case, and his breakfast was a half-smoked pipe and an empty cup. "Excellent, Watson," he greeted me, without raising his eyes from the magnifying glass. "You are just in time to witness the tracing of our clues. Observe." He indicated first the severed reins, which he had retrieved from the cart with Lestrade's grudging consent. They lay coiled upon a sheet of brown paper, the cut ends uppermost. "Note the angle of the slashes, sharp downward strokes from a right-handed man, made in haste, yet with considerable force. The blade was broad and single-edged, a heavy clasp knife of the pattern carried by carters and dock labourers. The cuts are clean, through both leather and trace, showing that the driver acted deliberately, not in random spasm. He knew he was dying and wished the horse to bolt as a signal to someone watching. Next, he turned to the wheels of the cart from which he had scraped samples of dried mud. This clay is distinctive, blue-grey, with a high proportion of river silt and fragments of crushed shell. It is found only along certain wharves below London Bridge, where the deeper dredgings are deposited. Our cart came from the pool within the last 24 hours. He pushed across the table a crumpled invoice he had discovered tucked beneath the driver's seat, a single sheet of cheap paper bearing a list of sundries, and an address scrawled in pencil. Hargrove, Warehouse 7, Stanton's Wharf, Wapping. "The name Hargrove appears again," he remarked dryly. "Yet as I ascertained by telegraph this morning, no such firm is registered at that address, nor indeed anywhere upon the river. The handwriting is clerkly, but the ink is common violet, used extensively in the cheaper Swiss counting houses." Finally, he held up one of the watches, its back removed to expose the movement. "I have examined every piece in detail. All bear the same subtle flaws. The pivot holes slightly off-center, the escapement wheels stamped rather than cut, the balance cocks engraved with a tool that leaves microscopic ridges characteristic of the factories at La Chaux-de-Fonds. Moreover, each movement bears a tiny scratch in the same position, an assembler's mark, no doubt, identifying the bench or the workman. These watches came from a single source in quantity. He leaned back, steepling his fingers. The driver, his name, by the way, was Josiah Beale, a former lighterman known along the docks, was employed to deliver the consignment from Stanton's Wharf to a receiver in the West End. Someone wished to prevent that delivery. Beale was poisoned, probably by a confederate who shared his flask earlier in the evening. In his last moments, he tried to warn his employers by freeing the horse. An arranged signal, perhaps, that if the animal returned alone, the cargo was compromised. I poured myself coffee and considered the evidence. Then the killer is either a rival smuggler or a legitimate importer driven beyond endurance, Holmes finished. The Watchmakers' Guild has petitioned Parliament repeatedly about the flood of Swiss counterfeits. Several respected houses teeter on the brink of ruin. A man who sees his life's work destroyed may take desperate measures. He rose and reached for his ulster. We shall begin at Stanton's Wharf. Lestrade will meet us there with a search warrant, but I prefer to arrive unannounced. Bring your revolver, Watson. This affair has already claimed one life, and those who deal in deception seldom stop at a single crime. As we descended the stairs into the pale December daylight, I reflected that the echo of hooves which had sounded the night before had set in motion a chain of inquiry that would lead us deep into the shadowy commerce of Victorian London, where time itself was being counterfeited for profit. The day proved raw and gusty, with a keen wind whipping the fog into ragged streamers along the Thames. Holmes and I took a hansom down to the river, alighting near Wapping Stairs, where the ancient wharves crowd close upon the water. The smell of tar, wet rope, and decaying cargo hung heavy in the air, mingled with the cries of gulls and the distant clang of buoys. Stanton's Wharf proved to be a long, low shed of blackened brick, its doors fastened with a new padlock that gleamed incongruously against the weathered wood. A watchman lounged nearby, smoking a short clay pipe, but Holmes's card and a few quiet words sent him shuffling off to warmer quarters. We moved along the riverfront, examining cart tracks in the mud. Holmes was soon upon his knees, lens in hand. "See here, Watson. The wheels match exactly. Same iron tires, same slight defect in the offside rim that left this crescent mark. The cart stood here yesterday evening loaded from that side door." He indicated a smaller entrance, half concealed by stacks of empty crates. The lock showed fresh scratches. Someone had forced it recently. Holmes produced a small instrument from his pocket, and in a moment we were inside. The warehouse was dim and cavernous, lit only by grimy skylights. Rows of crates lined the walls, many bearing the same vague labels we had seen the night before. Holmes pried one open at random and revealed more of the counterfeit watches, packed with the same care. "Thousands of pounds worth," he murmured. "A major operation." We pressed on, following faint traces of sawdust and oil to a small office at the rear. Here we found ledgers, shipping manifests, and a pile of correspondence, all in the name of the fictitious J. Hargrove. Holmes leafed swiftly through the papers. Regular consignments from a firm in La Chaux-de-Fonds, routed through Ostend to avoid the strictest customs examination. Payments in cash distributed through a West End jeweller named Mortimer in Bond Street. But note this letter, dated only last week, from the Secretary of the Watchmakers' Guild, warning of legal action if the flow of counterfeits is not stemmed. He folded the letter carefully into his pocketbook. Our next calls were upon several respectable jewellers in the neighbourhood of Regent Street. To each, Holmes showed one of the watches, asking casually whether similar pieces had lately come into their hands. The answers were guarded, but revealing. Several had been offered fine Swiss-made watches at suspiciously low prices, always through intermediaries who vanished when pressed. By late afternoon, we found ourselves in a smoky public house near the docks, where Holmes had arranged to meet a grizzled old lighterman who had known the dead driver, Josiah Beale. Over pots of ale, the man spoke freely. Josiah turned to carting after his lungs gave out on the river. Good steady fellow, but he'd fallen in with bad company these last months, running night deliveries for ready money, no questions asked. He told me once he feared the game was getting too hot. There was talk of a gentleman in the trade who'd sworn to put a stop to it by any means. A gentleman? Holmes pressed quietly. Aye. Tall, grey-haired, always well-spoken. Name of Sir Edward Fulbright, they say. Owns a big importing house in Clerkenwell. Been ruined near enough by the cheap foreign stuff coming in. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Sir Edward Fulbright. I recall the name from the Guild's petitions. We left the public house as dusk was falling and made our way to Clerkenwell, where Sir Edward's premises stood in a quiet square. The shutters were closed, but a light burned in an upper window. Holmes dispatched a telegram to Lestrade requesting his presence with men, then settled us in a shadowed doorway opposite to watch. The wind had dropped and the fog was thickening again. Somewhere in the distance a horse's hooves echoed on the stones, an eerie reminder of the sound that had begun it all. I felt the familiar thrill of the chase. Beside me, Holmes was motionless, his profile sharp against the lamplight, every sense alert. The net was drawing tight, and I knew that before another day had passed we should confront the man who had turned from victim to avenger in this curious affair of counterfeit time. Night had fallen by the time Inspector Lestrade arrived with half a dozen constables, their bull's-eye lanterns cutting pale tunnels through the thickening fog. Holmes briefed the little ferret-faced detective in a few crisp sentences, and we set off together for Sir Edward Fulbright's premises in Clerkenwell. The wind had dropped entirely. The city lay muffled and silent, broken only by the measured tread of our party and the occasional distant rumble of a cab. The importing house proved to be a substantial building of red brick, its ground floor given over to workshops and showrooms, the upper stories to offices and private apartments. A single gas lamp burned over the entrance, and a faint glow showed behind the blinds of the first-floor windows. Holmes motioned the constables to surround the building, then led Lestrade and myself to the side door used by clerks and porters. It was unlocked, a circumstance that caused my friend's eyes to gleam with satisfaction. We mounted the dimly lit stairs in silence. On the landing above, a door stood ajar, and from within came the low murmur of voices. Holmes paused, listening intently, then pushed the door open with a sudden movement. The room was a comfortably appointed office. Turkish carpet, mahogany desk, glass-fronted cabinets displaying fine watches of undoubted authenticity. Behind the desk sat a tall, distinguished gentleman of perhaps 60 years, grey hair, aquiline features, the unmistakable stamp of breeding and authority. His hand rested upon an open ledger. Before him lay one of the counterfeit watches we had seen the night before, its case pried apart as though for examination. He looked up as we entered, and for a moment surprise flickered across his patrician face. Then he rose slowly, with grave courtesy. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I presume. I have long wished to make your acquaintance, though I confess I scarcely expected the pleasure under such circumstances. Holmes inclined his head. Sir Edward Fulbright, your reputation as a master horologist precedes you. It is a pity that we meet over a matter so grave. Sir Edward's gaze moved to Lestrade and the constables crowding the doorway. A faint smile touched his lips. I perceive that explanations are in order. Pray be seated, gentlemen. He resumed his chair, gesturing to others opposite the desk. We remained standing. You have come about the death of Josiah Beale, he continued quietly, and about the cargo of counterfeit watches discovered last night in Baker Street. I shall not waste your time with denials. I poisoned the man. Lestrade gave a sharp exclamation and stepped forward, but Holmes raised a hand. Let him speak, Inspector. The confession is valuable only if complete. Sir Edward inclined his head. Complete it shall be. For 20 years my house has supplied the finest English watches to the nobility and gentry of this country. 3 generations of Fulbrights have laboured to maintain that standard. But in the last 5 years a flood of Swiss imitations, clever, cheap and utterly dishonest, has driven us to the brink of ruin. Petitions to Parliament, appeals to the Guild, all fruitless. The smugglers grew bolder, honest men were reduced to bankruptcy. I resolved to act where the law would not. Through an intermediary, I learned the route of one of their principal deliveries. Beale was known to me. He had once worked in my own shops before drink and misfortune brought him low. I arranged to meet him yesterday afternoon, ostensibly to offer him honest employment. We shared a glass from his flask. I had prepared it earlier with a measured dose of hydrocyanic acid, swift, painless, and certain. He left believing he had found a new situation. I calculated that death would overtake him in Baker Street, where the cargo would be discovered and the whole nefarious trade exposed. The severing of the reins was unforeseen, but it served my purpose by drawing immediate attention. He paused, his voice steady, his manner composed. I regret the necessity, but I do not repent it. One life weighed against the livelihood of hundreds of honest English workmen seemed a bitter but acceptable exchange. Holmes regarded him for a long moment in silence. A logical crime, Sir Edward, and courageously confessed. Yet the law draws no such balance. Inspector? Lestrade produced the handcuffs. Sir Edward rose and extended his wrists without a tremor. As he was led away, he paused beside Holmes. Tell me one thing, Mr. Holmes. How did you trace the matter to me so swiftly? My friend's answer was characteristically brief. The Echo of Hooves, Sir Edward. The horse, fleeing alone, carried your message farther than you intended, straight to my window. And so the case ended, not with a desperate villain unmasked in a den of thieves, but with the quiet surrender of a gentleman who had taken justice into his own hands when all lawful recourse had failed.